Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar on endpoint exploit prevention. Presenting to you today is Sophos' very own Matt Cook. Just a couple of housekeeping points before we start. The webinar is being recorded and a link will be emailed to all registrants, and the presentation time will be 30 minutes long with 10 minutes of question time. Please post any questions that you have via the go-to webinar question panel on the right hand side of the screen and they'll be answered at the end.
Okay, good morning everyone. This is Emma from BMS, the marketing manager here. Just before we hand you over to Matt, we just want to thank you for taking the time out to join us today. BMS have decided to put this webinar on specifically for our NHS customers because we feel that ransomware is such a hot topic at the moment and it's something that we're talking to our clients a lot about. As Tara said, that we will be sending a recording of the session afterwards, and if you require any further information on pricing, then please contact your BMS account manager directly. So thanks everyone. Over to you, Matt.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Brilliant. Right, welcome everyone. Thanks very much for joining. As we said, as we're going through, any questions at all, stick them in the chat panel or in the questions box. We'll get to those at the end. Even if you think we might cover them, stick it in there anyway because well, if we have covered it, we won't answer it at the end because we've already done it, but otherwise we'll get back around to it and make sure we get you answers to everything you want to know. So today's session is to talk about endpoint exploit prevention, or really is to talk more about ransomware, because I think that's the kind of most prevalent threat that everyone is facing right now. It's how do we deal with ransomware, and what we want to do is try and keep you out of the headlines. Headlines like this that, you know, quite often, well, they're quite scary headlines. Let's be honest about it. You know, we're talking about, you know, NHS trusts being hit by ransomware. We talk about libraries, entire library systems being shut down by ransomware. In fact, there was even one story about a hotel in, I think it was Austria, where guests were reported being locked in the rooms when actually they weren't locked in the rooms, and this was, again, it was a ransomware attack, and the reporting was a little out of control on this one, but it made for good fun on the story. But yeah, ultimately a key card system in a hotel was being locked up by ransomware, and you know, then we even hear horrendous stories, unfortunately, where our schools again are targeted with ransomware attacks, and the extra spin on those particular attacks where there was a set-up telephone call to let people know to expect an email. And in fact, one thing that was consistent, I think, amongst a lot of these ransomware stories that we hear about is the delivery of ransomware and how it gets down onto the machine. The most common method that we see is email comes through to recipient opens attachment is most likely a Word or Office document. It could be a zip file containing scripts, or it could just be a script itself, and somehow from that point onwards then ransomware gets deployed onto the system. There are lots of different ways it kind of happens from there onwards, but the long and the short of it is it's getting through our traditional email defenses. Now there's actually a lot you can do already to better protect yourself from ransomware without having to go off and invest in lots of new products and technology. Certainly some simple, easy techniques that you can apply that we've documented for you up on our website at sophos.com/ransomware. There's a nice paper on there that kind of gives you, I think it's 9 tips that it breaks it down into. But today, yeah, I definitely recommend go off, have a look at those, you know, work out which ones you can deploy. But today what we're looking at more specifically are some product enhancements that we've got for you, particularly if you're already a Sophos Endpoint Protection customer, that you can adopt, you can deploy. It's an additional license add-on to Endpoint Protection to allow you to better protect yourselves against ransomware. So we're going to look at that specifically. That's called Endpoint Exploit Prevention, and in fact we released this technology in a separate product, which was a cloud managed product called Intercept X a little while back, earlier last year, which, you know, specifically designed for both endpoint protection customers but also customers of other antivirus products as well, so you can kind of layer it on top of those, and that's all managed by Sophos Central. But we recognize there are a lot of organizations, particularly in the NHS, in fact, that can't manage their endpoints from Sophos Central. So what we've done now, and what we're going to be talking about today, is really how we've taken a lot of that protection technology and we've brought it now to on-premise managed endpoint protection customers. So if you're using endpoint protection today and it's managed by Sophos Enterprise Console, The Endpoint Exploit Prevention add-on, which we're going to talk about today, is how you can take advantage of these additional bits of technology that are going to better protect you against not just ransomware, but against a lot of the advanced threats that we're all facing today, unfortunately, hitting our endpoints. So, Endpoint Exploit Prevention, this add-on then. This add-on assumes that you've already got endpoint protection from Sophos, either standard or advanced, and it's managed by Enterprise Console. As I said, it's an additional license that you can purchase to activate this functionality, and this is what you get. You get anti-ransomware technology, specifically what we call CryptoGuard, and CryptoGuard is your last chance saloon, if you like, against ransomware. If you happen to get ransomware down on your machine, if it gets through your email security defenses, a user opens that attachment, then this is your last chance saloon. This is where we identify the behavior of ransomware, spot it, isolate it, and prevent it from doing any particular damage to the user's machines. We've also got anti-exploit technology in there, protecting you against software vulnerabilities, and this is when you're running versions of an operating system that perhaps haven't had all the patches deployed, perhaps your web browser hasn't had all the patches deployed, or Office applications, or Adobe PDFs, or in fact pretty much any application that you could be using. Our anti-exploit technology is effectively going to close that window of opportunity where attackers look to exploit those vulnerabilities, and we'll talk more exactly how we do that in a few seconds. And then the third component of endpoint exploit prevention is remediation, and this is our Sophos clean technology, where we're able to go off and do a deep system clean. So whereas historically endpoint protection and antivirus has all been about putting a piece of malware in quarantine and deleting it, now we've got the ability to understand exactly what the malware did on a system. Don't just remove the malware. What did the malware do? Did it touch registry files? Registry settings? Did it create additional files? What else did it touch on our machine? And we can go off and do a deep system clean to remove all the traces of malware. So let's look at those individually. We'll start off with anti-exploit technology and talk about vulnerabilities to exploit. I talked briefly about patching and the need for patching on our systems that we have, right? Because we're all using applications that have vulnerabilities. It's a good example. My favorite web browser, let's say it was Firefox or Chrome or Internet Explorer, whatever it happens to be, I browse off to a particular website. Now what we see is if my browser hasn't been up to date, hasn't been updated, in fact not just my browser but any plugins or extensions that I might be using in that browser, if they're not up to date, now there's a good chance that they're going to be vulnerable, and they're going to be vulnerable to attack. And so out in the wild we see exploit kits being used, and so I could just be browsing away to my favorite news site or whatever that website happens to be. Now if a component on that website has been hijacked and an exploit kit has been deployed, then this exploit kit effectively tests my browser and says, are you vulnerable to this particular vulnerability, or I'm trying to exploit you here. Are you vulnerable to this one? No, you've got the patch. Okay, what about this one? What about this one? And it'll keep testing me in the background without me knowing anything about this until it finds something that I'm vulnerable to. And if it finds something, then the attackers then use that exploit or that vulnerability as a method to then deploy their favorite malware. And at the moment, that's typically ransomware. And in fact, this is some research that Microsoft did just back in January, where they published the use of exploit kits in the wild, and we saw a dip towards the end of last year, thankfully, which was due to a couple of takedowns of exploit kits. But they're still prevalent, and we're still seeing them being deployed. In Microsoft, have reported here that they're still seeing ransomware being deployed through exploit kits. And quite honestly, there's very little that you can do about it. The best advice you can do is patch early and patch often. But at the end of the day, you could be vulnerable to and your plugins could be vulnerable to these exploits. So we need to be better prepared against that. And as again, from this same piece of research, just as an example here, this is where exploits or vulnerabilities were identified when patches were first made available and when the exploit was first seen being used in an exploit kit in the wild. So, as an example, we can pick the one perhaps right in the middle that says, okay, Internet Explorer, this was a vulnerability was identified and it was patched back on May the 10th last year, and the exploit was first seen being used in the wild on July the 14th. Now that's a great a good scenario, in fact, right? Because if Microsoft released the patch for Internet Explorer on May the 10th, well, as long as we patched that sometime before July the 14th when it was first seen in the wild, then we're in a good shape, because then that obviously we weren't vulnerable to that exploit. Now, that assumes we deployed the patch, or you deployed the patch, and you did it quickly. And the reality is that we know that people don't deploy patches in a timely manner. Quite often they might have rigorous testing processes and build systems that they have to run through to validate these, and that can lead to a delay in the patch being deployed. And essentially, the longer you delay from deploying a patch, the more exposure, or the more risk you're exposing your users and your endpoints to for a particular vulnerability. So again, patch early, patch often. And the other example is a bit of an extreme one here, which is perhaps second up from the bottom, which was a Adobe Flash vulnerability, which was first patched on April the 7th last year, but in fact it was first seen in the wild being used in an exploit kit on April the 2nd. Now in that scenario, that means that it was being exploited before the patch was available. So that's, we're into 0-day territory there, which is an unfortunate scenario, because it means that everyone is vulnerable until the patch is then available, and everyone potentially could be hit through that mechanism. So we need a better way of protecting ourselves against these vulnerabilities. We can't just rely on patches being available, and that's what the anti-exploit technology in our endpoint exploit prevention add-on here delivers, because we know from all the vulnerability databases out there that there are thousands of vulnerabilities reported in different apps every single year. And when we look at those vulnerabilities and how they're being exploited, well, there are probably only exploits in their hundreds that are the ones that are actually being exploited out in the wild. And what we've done is then gone off and looked at those exploits and said, what can we identify that's common among the methods that the attackers use to exploit these vulnerabilities? And we've identified those, and that's numbers down in their tens. And in fact, it's in the 20s at the moment. So what we've done is built our technology to identify these methods that the attackers are using, meaning that we only have to look for a handful of techniques that the attackers use in order to protect us against the thousands of vulnerabilities that we potentially have, whether they're known vulnerabilities or even unknown vulnerabilities. And in fact, what we tend to see when we're looking at anti-exploit technology, we tend to see that attackers use multiple techniques during any given attack. And as an example here, you can see in the preparation stage, the triggering, the control stage, number of different techniques being used. And our anti-exploit technology, which is in endpoint exploit prevention, and in fact is also in our Intercept X product, which is why it's listed out here for you, that will protect you against those techniques being used. And this is a good slide, gives you an idea as to why traditional antivirus and endpoint protection isn't overly effective against this method of delivery of ransomware and other malicious activity, because quite often this attack goes through memory. It never actually drops a file down on disk in the final stage of the attack, because your antivirus product is essentially scanning files on your disk, looking for the behavior of programs as they're being run. But in this case, the attack is all going through memory itself. And so what we need to do is identify that attack before it actually turns into malicious activity. And that is essentially what anti-exploit technology is doing, and that's what's in endpoint exploit prevention. Now, the other core component, we talked about 3 components in endpoint exploit prevention, is anti-ransomware, and specifically our CryptoGuard technology, which again, if you're familiar with Intercept X, this is technology again that we've taken from Intercept X to make it available to on-premise managed endpoint customers. And CryptoGuard essentially sits there looking for the behavior of ransomware. So if an email does get through to you with an attachment, which is unfortunately going to start a malicious ransomware attack, well, CryptoGuard is kind of your last chance saloon here. CryptoGuard is looking for the behavior of ransomware. If we see ransomware start opening files, changing them, writing them back again, we can immediately identify malicious behavior. We isolate the process, we stop the process, and we look at exactly what's changed. In fact, what we're also doing is every time a file is opened and read, we're taking a small copy of that in a proprietary cache locally on the machine just before the ransomware encrypts it. And what that means is that we'll detect this ransomware after it's probably encrypted 3 or 4 files on your machine. But fear not, because we've got that proprietary cache, we can immediately roll back those files so that the user actually notices no impact of this ransomware. In fact, what you'll see is that in a bit they'll get a little pop-up in the system tray when I take you through the screenshots to say you got ransomware, but don't fear not, all of your files are still available on your machine. So this is why I kind of describe this as a last chance saloon. This is the ability to both detect ransomware when it's active and roll back the original files without having any a negative impact, if you like, on the user themselves. And then back on the admin console, we'll give you the visibility into exactly what's gone on. And in fact, also with our Intercept X product, you'll get root cause analysis details as well available through the portal, which I'll show you what that looks like. But you get the full details also in Enterprise Console. Okay, so remediation. This is the third stage or the third piece of functionality. So as part of this endpoint exploit prevention license, we'll also deploy an additional product to the agents that we call Sophos Clean, or it's just another executable essentially. Now, Sophos Clean, we provide Sophos Clean as a remediation tool separately, and Sophos Clean will automatically get distributed and will go off and when you execute Sophos Clean on the machine, it will look for things like browser cookies, files, registry settings, running processes, and really any traces of malware that have been found on a machine. Because if you get malware, it's no longer good enough just to remove the malware and move along. Quite often we see, multi-stage attacks going on where bits of malware have been left for the attacker to use at a later date on the system. So, it's important that we go through and do a complete removal of all traces of that malware. And so Sophos Clean is distributed for you. It can be invoked from the command line or the user. You can instruct to do that, or you can, if you've got system automation tools as well, you can invoke a scan with Sophos Clean as well if you need to. Alright, so demonstration. We're going to walk through a couple of screenshots now of what this will look like to the end user. Now is probably a kind of a good time. If you've got questions lurking in the back of your mind, stick them in the Q&A panel on the GoToWebinar here so that we can make sure that we address those when we get to the end. But from a user's perspective here, or in fact, let's talk through all the components first of all. If you're already using Sophos Endpoint Protection and you're using the Enterprise Console, the first step for you here is to upgrade your Enterprise Console to the latest version, which has just been released, and that is 5.50, which will be available now for you on the download site on sophos.com. Once you've upgraded your Enterprise Console, you can then purchase the additional license for your endpoints. Now, Endpoint Exploit Prevention will cover your Windows 7, 32 and 64-bit operating system or desktop operating systems and above. And in fact, the Endpoint Exploit Prevention license, or rather endpoint licenses, can be applied to servers as well. Now, you may be using endpoint protection licenses on your server. If you're doing that, you can also purchase the EXP or refer to endpoint exploit prevention licenses for the server, as long as it's Windows Server 2008 R2 and above as well, and that will install the CryptoGuard only technology on the server to protect your files on the server from ransomware as well. So that's all covered within the EXP license. So you purchase as many EXP licenses as required. Once they've been activated, the functionality will then automatically appear within Enterprise Console to allow you to create exploit prevention policies. This is a quick look at what that will look like for you, where you can enable exploit prevention, you can enable CryptoGuard, and you can see you can enable the exploit technique mitigations for vulnerable applications in here as well. So you can go through, create your new policy. Once you've done that, you then reprotect your agents or reprotect your endpoints, and that will then deploy this extra functionality to your endpoints automatically so that they will then be reprotected and have the anti-exploit and the CryptoGuard technology automatically protecting them, and then you'll have access to run clean as and when you need to on those machines as well. So that's what the admin side of things looks like. From the user, probably the easiest way to look at that is if we make a user get hit by ransomware. So, quick example here, user, classic ransomware example, user gets email, user opens email attachment, user ignores all of the warnings on the screen and follows the instruction from the attacker that says click your enable editing button or enable macros or whatever that big button happens to be at the top of Word that says turn off protected view and ignore all of all of the good work that we've tried to protect you with in Microsoft Word. Of course, once the user does that, then, as we've said, that typically at that point, that's what unfortunately invokes a ransomware attack from there. Now, what they'll see down in the system tray is, exploit prevention pops up. It tells them we've prevented an exploit, and that's CryptoGuard has kicked in. So what actually happened was the ransomware ran, it encrypted a few files, CryptoGuard kicked in and said, not doing that, rolled back the original files for the user, got rid of the ransomware for us, and generated the alert back on the management console as well. So back in Enterprise Console, as an admin, you can see the ransomware that has been run. In this case, it was just a simulator test that we ran, just so that you can see the example. But you kind of get the idea here that obviously you've then got the alerts, and you can take appropriate action if you need to from that point forward. Okay, so that's what endpoint exploit prevention looks like. That's what it looks like to an end user. It's a pop-up in the system tray that's protecting you against ransomware. Similarly, if it was an exploit attack where you perhaps browsed to a website and you were being tested for vulnerabilities, you'd get those alerts coming back here in the admin console as well. Now, think back at the start, I mentioned that the functionality that we've added here into your endpoint protection with this exploit prevention license has originally come from our Intercept X product. So I just wanted to highlight the key sort of differences between endpoint exploit prevention and Intercept X, and what the core difference that's really to highlight is where things are managed from, because endpoint exploit prevention is managed on-premise, or on-premises, it should say there with a missing S, by Enterprise Console, that hopefully you're already using, you're already familiar with. Intercept X specifically is managed by Sophos Central. So Sophos Central is our cloud-based platform designed to manage endpoints, which we recognize that not everyone can take advantage of cloud-based platforms. If you can, then the additional functionality that you get over and above Enterprise Console is the ability to process telemetry at scale. Now, of course, if we're managing from up in the cloud, we can leverage some of the benefits of the cloud for management, and that really is involved with processing telemetry. So we can give you some nice visualizations of, yes, there was an attack, yes, there was ransomware, here's what it looked like, here's what it did. And if we hover over each one of those, you can see that everything would start in Outlook, and Outlook would launch Word, and Word would go off and start downloading files from the internet that we wouldn't expect, and then start launching other processes which modify registry settings. And this kind of gives you the whole visualization of the attack. And behind that, of course, what we're doing is crunching that telemetry for you at scale from all of your endpoints. And not only that, if you're using other Sophos products as well, we can combine a lot of that telemetry together, allow you to manage them all from one place, and give you the advantages of that shared context, so that we can better protect your endpoints. So that's really just the key difference, I guess, between Intercept X and endpoint protection when you're being managed on premise. Obviously, managing this on premise, unless you build out the scaling capability and the telemetry processing capability behind the scenes, you can't do this type of visualization. So that's kind of the key differences between the two. The other one being that endpoint exploit prevention requires you to have Sophos Endpoint Protection, either standard or advanced, managed by Enterprise Console, whereas Intercept X you can install and run to add the anti-exploit and the CryptoGuard technology on top of another vendor's antivirus product that you may happen to be using. Alright, so that pretty much covers everything that we wanted to talk to you about today. So what I want to do is start addressing some of the questions that have been coming through. I'll leave the contact details for BMS here on the screen, so that obviously you can talk to them in more detail about this after today. But in the meantime, again, if you've got questions, now's the best time to stick them in the chat box, and we'll start running through a few of those now. Okay, so good question. Right, so here's the first question. The first question is, let me kind of paraphrase this one a little bit. Long story short, why does traditional antivirus really not protect me very well against ransomware? Why do I need something extra to protect me against ransomware? That's a really good question. The majority of the answer really kind of is based around the way that that malicious attacks really have evolved. One of the big challenges is with ransomware is pretty much every time ransomware gets run on any different machine, it looks different every single time. So your traditional antivirus products and endpoint protection products are really kind of focused on identifying the malware that it knows about, identifying malware through signatures. Now, that of course is very, very different to do if every time that the malware runs or is distributed to a machine it looks different because it has different keys in it and it's launched through different processes. And in fact, in many cases it's launched using tools on the system itself, i.e. built-in encryption capabilities or scripting capabilities within Windows. And so it makes it incredibly difficult to identify. It doesn't mean it's impossible, it means it's just incredibly difficult. And so we have to evolve and look at other ways to do that and other ways to better protect ourselves against attacks like ransomware. And the CryptoGuard technology is a brand new technology that that Sophos has built and that Sophos is developing really just to better identify the behavior of ransomware to protect us against that. So it's not seen as a traditional antivirus method, it's seen more as a next generation protection method. Can it be used on Windows 10? Yeah, absolutely. I think when I described before, I started off by saying Windows 7. I actually meant to say Windows 7 and above. So it's Windows 7 and above, 32 and 64-bit, so that includes Windows 8, 8.1 and Windows 10 in there also. And if it's being deployed on servers, that's also Windows Server 2008 R2 and above, which is 64-bit only. Is there a cost involved if I want to move to Central, or how does the cost compare to Intercept X? So, really good question. I mean, it's pretty much the same price as Intercept X. In fact, I think you'll find it's exactly the same. So really, it's a cost-neutral process to move to Sophos Central for management if you wanted to do that. It does involve a relicensing, but essentially it's cost-neutral. It's it won't have any negative effect for you to do that to switch over to that platform. So yeah, the benefit of doing it means that you get the extra visualization, but the so if you're able to do that, then I definitely would recommend that approach. But yeah, it involves a bit of relicensing, but it doesn't involve any essentially any additional cost over and above the cost of endpoint exploit prevention. So can we use our normal Sophos AV and then Intercept X alongside each other? Actually, no, you can't. The reason for that is both Intercept X and endpoint exploit prevention are essentially components that we deploy that sit inside of your existing Sophos Endpoint agent. And your Sophos Endpoint agent is the mechanism that calls those components when it needs them and is the mechanism that controls the communication back to the management console. And so in other words, if there's a endpoint agent already there, it will leverage that and therefore it can only talk to one management console at any one time. So no, you can't do that. If you're using existing Sophos Endpoint Protection and you're managed by Enterprise Console, you'll need to deploy endpoint exploit prevention. If alternatively you can switch to central management and then use Sophos Endpoint and Intercept X as well at the same time. So if you currently have on-premises managed Sophos, is it easy to contractually and technically switch to Sophos Central? I'll take two questions in one there. Yeah, I mean contractually it does require a relicensing, so that we just switch your licenses over to be managed by Sophos Central. Technically, we've got a migration tool that you can run that effectively just repoints your endpoints back to Sophos Central as well, so that you can manage them through that route if you wish to do so. Okay, so we're currently tied into using another vendor's endpoint solution, but we have been looking already at Intercept X for having that additional protection. Can we run the two side by side? So in other words, you carry on using your other endpoint agent, and can you then layer Intercept X on top? Yeah, absolutely you can, and in fact that's how Intercept X has been designed to run, is alongside other vendors' AV. So we recognise that other vendors don't necessarily or haven't extended endpoints to include anti-exploit, anti-ransomware, and the root cause analysis capabilities. So, specifically we have built it in such a way that it will run alongside that. Okay, so let's make sure I'm covering off all the other ones. Another one popped in at the bottom. Okay, so will the root cause analysis feature in Intercept X come to on-premise? Unfortunately, it's not possible to bring that feature to on-premise, at least not without building out huge data centers and having the ability to process the data at scale. I mean, this is one of the big benefits of using the cloud platform for management, is that we can take advantage of the power of the cloud behind there to do the analytics work. So not only is it combining the telemetry from your endpoint agents together to understand, you know, what goes on in an attack, but it's also combining the Sophos telemetry behind the scenes as well, so that we can start to then give you information about what we know as well. So, you know, when we see known bad sites, for example, being accessed, we can start to hook into that and give you more and more information. And in fact, what you'll see over time is we will expand that out further to, you know, use telemetry from the other products in there at the same time. So it's unlikely that you'll well, it's not unlikely. It's unfortunately we won't be able to bring that level of capability and that user interface back into Enterprise Console. However, having said that, what we are doing is looking at ways that in the future that we can deploy an on-premises based management console that can leverage that capability. That's more of a longer term project. In order to be able to do that requires a lot of architectural work behind the scenes. So yeah, that probably will arrive in the future, but we are talking a little way off in order to do that. So if you want to leverage that right now, then moving to Sophos Central is the way to go for management there. All right, perfect. Okay, hopefully that has answered all of your questions that have come through there. If you've got any more, please do get in touch with our colleagues at BMS. You know, they're here and ready to help answer the questions. By all means, get in touch with me as well. I'm very happy to answer any questions that you've got. So beyond that, thank you all very much for joining today. As we said, I will get a recording out to you after today so that you can kind of go back through and review some of this. Other resources was sophos.com/ransomware, which is a good place to go in order to get additional tips on how you can better deal with ransomware.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Matt, for the presentation today. I'm sure everyone found it very useful. I just wanted to say at the end of this, you'll be served with a short survey, and we'd really appreciate it if you could fill that out for us. So thank you very much for listening, and bye for now.